Hey there, YouTube. Bearded Skywalker asked a question, and it was along the lines of what music has influenced your life the most. This question's right up my alley, man. I've probably made a video about this in the past, I don't recall, but I'll answer it from the point of view of what specific records really charted the course of my musical journey in life. It's been an eclectic one, to say the least. Started out, my dad was into old time country, like, not old time country, he was into older, like 50s and early 60s country, like Marty Robbins, Lefty Frizzell, Hank Snow, stuff like that. And then a little bit later, like maybe in the early mid 70s, he was into like the outlaw stuff, like Waylon Willie, Merle Haggard, Buck Owens. What's that one guy's name? I can't remember his name. I'll probably think of it before the video's over. But I listened to a lot of stuff like that when I was around my dad. My mom wasn't really into music. She liked Elvis, and that was about it. And then whatever was on the radio. She wasn't really a music fan. My older brother was of the age when I was really just kind of getting into music at all. Was of the age where when I was that age, I was really into music, and he had pretty decent taste back then. So he had quite a few albums and 8 tracks and cassettes laying around. So most of the stuff I listened to was stuff he bought. But I thought I would see, what have I got here? I got a dozen albums written down. These 12 albums are what really turned me into a music fan. I've listened to these albums countless times, especially when I was younger, and some of them I still listen to fairly often. Three or four of them for sure. But these were either albums he had or early albums I bought. Like one of these I bought when I was 9 years old, I think. So anyway, first one I bought wasn't with my own money. It was, I don't know, my mom or grandmother or somebody gave me some money to go buy an album. I think it was Kiss Destroyer. And I think that was in 1976 when I bought that. I think I was 9 years old. And man, I wore that sucker out. I'm telling you what, I've owned it on album, CD, cassette, digitally. I've owned it in every way that you can own it, except for 8-track. Anyway, I listened to that a lot. I wanted to be in Kiss when I was that age. I mean, they were everything. It was like there was no other music for a couple of years besides Kiss. But that was the first album that I actually bought. First album I bought with my own money that I earned was Alice Cooper, From the Inside. That was the first one that I ever actually bought, though. So some other albums that I listened, like I said, I listened to these over and over, and they led me in directions. Some of them led me this way, some of them led me that way, some of them, all kinds of different stuff. But anyway, Alice Cooper, Billion Dollar Babies. My brother had that album, and my mom thought it was the most ungodly thing ever. I loved it. Wings Over America. That was Paul McCartney's triple album, a live triple album. And I think it probably had, I don't know, 28, 30 songs, something like that on it probably. But it was a cool concert from about 1976, I think, was when the concert was. But I learned I could sing that album by heart. I mean, everything on there was just great. The Beach Boys, Endless Summer. It was kind of a greatest hits album that came out in the early mid 70s. It was a double album, and I absolutely wore that one out. I've always been a Beach Boys fan, especially their early stuff. Just great harmonies and great songs, good stuff. Now we're kind of getting into the meat of the stuff that really kind of influenced me. Jerry Rafferty, City to City. That is probably one of the most underrated albums, most overlooked albums ever, and it's just full of great music. It's got Right Down the Line on it. It's got Baker Street, one of my favorite songs of all time, favorite guitar solo of all time. And it's just got all kinds of good stuff on it. Jerry Rafferty was in Steelers Wheel until he went solo. Man, I listened to that album I don't know how many times. This was one of my brothers. Cheap Trick, Live at Budokan. Classic album. Go back and listen to it now. It doesn't hold up as well as it did then to me. I mean, it's kind of it's not a very well produced album, but back then the energy that those guys brought it was unbelievable. Cheap Trick, Queen, News of the World. That was another biggie. I found that before I found any of their older stuff, like, Night at the Opera and all that stuff. But yeah, that was the first Queen that I ever heard. I think that's the one. News of the World had We Are the Champions, We Will Rock You, Sheer Heart Attack, I think, was on that. But anyway, I listened to that one a ton, and it had great cover art. Big double fold out cover with the big robot looking thing killing people. Fantastic. This was another of my brothers, and this is an absolute classic album. This could probably be in a lot of people's top 20 albums ever list. Aerosmith, Toys in the Attic. I don't know what I thought about them when I first heard that stuff, but man, I grew to appreciate that band. Their first 5-6 albums or something are just should be in some kind of museum or something. It's just great stuff. Now this is one you might think, what? But this one, 1978, I think it was, a movie came out and it had a soundtrack on it, and I just absolutely loved the movie. I was 10 years old, 11 years old maybe. Probably hadn't turned 11 yet. Loved the movie, loved the nostalgia factor of it, and then the soundtrack led me back into history of music, and that led me back the other direction in a whole new way. That was the soundtrack from Grease. All that 50s music, doo-wop, and all that good stuff. Loved that album. Kansas, Leftoverture, one of the classics of all time. Has another one of my favorite songs ever on it. But I actually had the opportunity because my brother used to win tickets off the radio to go to concerts back when you could actually do it, be the 10th caller, and you didn't have 8 million people calling in. And he won tickets to a bunch of shows, but one of them was Kansas in 1979. And he, for whatever reason, I don't remember if my mom wouldn't let him go or what, I was going to be at my dad's house that weekend, and he gave me those tickets just to say, here, you can use them, knowing that I wouldn't be able to go, right? My dad let me go. So me and my stepbrother went to see Kansas in 1979. I was 11 years old. Unbelievable. I also saw Ted Nugent like that, and I also saw Van Halen like that in the the early 80s. Those were both in 81. Anyway, another one of my brother's albums that I got into, and I thought it was just the neatest thing. Had some of the coolest sounds, weirdest stuff, just kind of off the wall. That was ELO's Out of the Blue. That's another double album. And I've been a fan of ELO ever since, and that goes way back. And the last one that's on this list is kind of an oddball, I think, in the list, because the style of music isn't something that I ever really got into, but it kind of it kind of introduced me to stuff like 80s music that I really got into, like punk and new wave, Devo, Blondie, synth music, that kind of stuff. And that was Gary Wright, Dreamweaver. Just a really lush, beautiful sounding album, all synthesizer. The whole album is just synthesizer music. It was a little bit, different from what I was used to listening to, but it turned me on to some pretty cool stuff. And then after that period, after those albums, when I was about 13, it was when John Lennon died, which was right before I turned 13, like a week before. When he died, a local radio station decided to play all of the Beatles music, every single album in its entirety, and I recorded it onto cassette tapes, every single one of them. And that's back when you just pretty much put a tape recorder in front of your speaker, But I did it, and I fell in love with Beatles music, and that really sent me down a new path when I was 13. It got me to really appreciate different kinds of music, because within the Beatles catalog, you've got that early, almost bubblegum pop kind of stuff, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and then you got into the moodier stuff on like Revolver and Rubber Soul. Then you got into the psychedelic stuff, and then you got into the White Album and Abbey Road. I mean, it was a real journey for a 13-year-old to go on in one weekend, all at one time. And I'd really only heard, maybe, 10 or 15 of their songs. Whatever they played on the radio in the late 70s is all I'd ever really heard. That sent me down a path. And then right around that time, my sister-in-law at the time introduced me to Fleetwood Mac Rumors, and that kind of opened up a whole new door. I mean, it was like all of a sudden, all this other music had great guitars and stuff in it, but all of a sudden here was something that was different. You had harmonies, melody, great guitar playing, great songwriting, all this different stuff, and it just kind of, blew the doors wide open for me. And it wasn't long after that, my stepbrothers introduced me to Ozzy, Black Sabbath, Metallica, early Def Leppard, and stuff like that. And that sent me down the whole metal journey, and that was primarily where I went through the 80s into the 90s. But yeah, that's kind of the stuff that set a hook in me back when I was a kid. And man, I if I did a list of like the top 20 albums or top 50 albums, a couple of those might show up. But it would be completely different than probably what you would expect. I mean, it's kind of all over the place. I mean, I think some of the best albums that have ever been made are like Pink Floyd's The Wall. And I'm not talking about the songs necessarily versus like Dark Side of the Moon. I mean the way the whole album was put together, production, sound, everything. I think it's one of the best albums ever. Willie Nelson's Red-Headed Stranger, I think, is one of the best albums ever. Queensryche, Operation Mindcrime. Jethro Tull, Aqualung. if I keep doing this, I'll just keep going. But you kind of get my idea. It just kind of goes in all different directions, and I think those 12 albums is what sent me in those different directions, because very few of them are similar. I mean, there's a couple of heavy rock in there, but most everything is just different. Anyway, there you go. Hope you enjoyed it. I sure did.